In the scorching summer of 1983, Kansas wheat farmers watched their crops wither under skies that refused to rain for 97 consecutive days. The official explanation blamed El Niño patterns and atmospheric pressure anomalies. But what if those withered fields were actually the testing ground for the most sophisticated weather manipulation apparatus ever constructed, a device so advanced that even its creators couldn't fully control it? What if the Kremlin had aimed a beam of ionospheric disruption directly at America's breadbasket? And the only reason we're learning about it now is because the last scientist who understood how to operate had died in a Moscow apartment in 2022, leaving behind a confession that the CIA didn't declassify until 14 months ago. Before we dive into the depths of this declassified nightmare, if you're fascinated by hidden Cold War technology and the secrets governments buried for decades, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. This channel brings you the documented mysteries that mainstream history refuses to touch. And drop a comment below telling me which year you think weather manipulation actually became operational. Because what you're about to hear will change every assumption you have about atmospheric science. 3 facts were buried in the declassified operation. Skyfire documents that nobody in the mainstream media bothered to investigate. First, in February 1983, 5 months before the Kansas drought began, the National Security Agency intercepted a burst transmission from the Semipolodinsk test site in Kazakhstan that contained mathematical models for tropospheric electron precipitation. The transmission lasted exactly 7 seconds and used a frequency modulation pattern that wouldn't be replicated by any known Soviet system until 1987. Second, a Midwestern Agricultural Insurance Consortium noticed that the drought's geographic boundary followed an almost perfect parabolic arc, with the vertex positioned precisely over Hutchinson, Kansas. A pattern that meteorologists at the time dismissed as coincidental, but that perfectly matches the dispersion footprint of a focused electromagnetic beam projected from a 30-degree orbital inclination. Third, and this is where it gets genuinely unsettling, a atmospheric researcher named Dr. Ellen Wikström published a paper in the Journal of Research in September 1983, analyzing ionospheric disturbances over the Great Plains during the drought period. Her paper documented sudden depletions of electrons at exactly 287 kilometers altitude, occurring in pulses every 6 hours and 43 minutes. She couldn't explain the mechanism. 6 weeks after publication, her research funding was revoked without explanation, and the paper was retracted due to what the journal called procedural irregularities in data collection methodology. Wikström never published again. The periodicity she documented, that 6-hour and 43-minute interval, matches precisely the orbital period of Kosmos 1447, a Soviet satellite officially described as a passive geodetic research platform, but which carried a power generation system rated at 12 megawatts, roughly 4,000 times more powerful than any satellite officially acknowledged to exist in 1983. The machine itself, according to the declassified technical schematics that emerged from the FSB archives in 2023, was called Sistema Pogoda-7, which translates awkwardly as Weather System 7, though the number designation implies at least 6 predecessor iterations that remain completely unknown to Western intelligence. The fundamental operating principle exploited a phenomenon that Western atmospheric physicists wouldn't even theorize about until the late 1990s, something called mesoscale convective vortex suppression through targeted electron density modification. Picture the atmosphere as a vast ocean of charged particles, constantly flowing, constantly interacting with the Earth's magnetic field. Now imagine you could selectively remove electrons from a specific altitude band over a specific geographic region, creating what amounts to an electromagnetic void. The natural atmospheric circulation patterns that would normally trigger cloud formation and precipitation depend on these charged particles to seed the condensation process. Remove the electrons, and you create what meteorologists call a persistent anticyclonic anomaly, a high-pressure dome that deflects weather systems around its perimeter like water flowing around a stone in a stream. The documents reveal that Sistema Pogoda-7 was never a single device, but rather a networked array of three components. The primary element was Kosmos 1447 itself, which carried a magnetoplasmatic thruster, not for propulsion, but for generating a tightly focused beam of accelerated xenon ions. These ions, when directed into the ionosphere at a precise angle, would trigger a cascade effect. Stripping electrons from nitrogen and oxygen molecules across a conical volume of space, roughly 400 kilometers in diameter at ground level. The second component was a ground-based phased array radar installation located 17 kilometers southeast of Semipalatinsk, operating at frequencies between 154 and 167 megahertz, which provided real-time ionospheric density mapping and allowed operators to fine-tune the satellite's targeting parameters. The third component, and this is the detail that makes the whole system simultaneously brilliant and terrifying, was a series of 12 unmanned aerial vehicles designated as Tupolev Tu-243 reconnaissance drones, which had been modified to carry cesium vapor magnetometers. These drones would fly continuous racetrack patterns around the perimeter of the targeted zone, measuring magnetic field variations with extraordinary precision and feeding that data back to the CM control center via encrypted VHF burst transmissions. This closed-loop feedback system meant that Sistema Pogoda-7 could maintain a stable weather suppression effect for weeks or even months, continuously adjusting for atmospheric turbulence, solar wind variations, and the Earth's rotation. Why Kansas, specifically? The documents suggest that the target wasn't chosen randomly or even primarily for its agricultural significance. The geometry of the operation required a target zone located between 37 and 40 degrees north latitude to optimize the angle at which Kosmos 1447's ion beam would intersect with the natural electron density layers of the ionosphere. Additionally, the target needed to be far from oceanic moisture sources that might overwhelm the suppression effect. Kansas represented an ideal testing ground because the region's agricultural output was economically significant enough that the effects would be noticed and documented by civilian authorities, providing the Soviet military with real-world validation data for the system's effectiveness, but not so critical that the American government would suspect foreign intervention rather than natural drought. There's a chilling calculation buried in Appendix 7 of the declassified report. Soviet agronomists had modeled the expected crop losses and concluded that a 3-month drought in Kansas would reduce American wheat exports by approximately 18%, driving up global grain prices by an estimated 11 to 14%, which would partially offset the economic impact of the USSR's own chronic agricultural failures. Whether warfare wasn't about destroying the enemy, it was about evening the score without firing a shot. The human element of the story centers on a man whose name appears in the declassified files only as subject, though cross-referencing with Soviet scientific publications from the era suggests. This was almost certainly Dr. Mikhail Andreyevich Kharitonov, a plasma physicist who had worked on the Soviet laser program in the 1970s before transitioning to ionospheric research. Kharitonov was reportedly the architect of the electron depletion cascade mechanism that made Sistema Pogoda-7 viable. According to a debriefing transcript of a KGB officer who defected to Britain in 1987, Kharitonov had initially developed the technology for the purely defensive purpose of disrupting American over-the-horizon radar systems, creating blind spots in U.S. early warning networks that Soviet bombers could exploit. The weaponization of the system for weather manipulation emerged almost by accident when researchers noticed that the ionospheric disturbances they were creating had downstream effects on local weather patterns near their test site. Someone, the documents don't specify who, realized the potential within 80 months. Sistema Pogoda-7 had gone from a theoretical curiosity to a fully operational strategic asset, and Karatanov found himself leading a program that had implications he apparently never intended. The 1983 Kansas operation, designated Operacja Zasuka, meaning Operation Drought, began on April 23rd according to the Soviet mission logs, though the effects wouldn't become apparent to American meteorologists for another 3 weeks. The activation sequence required Kosmos 1447 to execute a series of orbital adjustments to position itself in a sun-synchronous orbit that would pass over Kansas every 6 hours and 43 minutes. Precisely the periodicity that Dr. Wikström would later document. Each pass lasted approximately 9 minutes, during which the satellite's ion beam would fire in pulses lasting 7 seconds each, with 30-second intervals to allow the magnetoplasmatic thruster to recharge. The ground-based radar at Semipolotensky maintained continuous ionospheric monitoring, and the Tu-243 drones rotated through their patrol sectors in shifts, ensuring constant magnetic field surveillance. The system achieved what Soviet operators called established suppression. On May 11th, the date when measurable precipitation in the target zone effectively ceased. For the next 97 days, the machine ran with only minor interruptions for satellite telemetry issues and one 5-day maintenance period in July when solar flare activity threatened to overwhelm the control systems. American intelligence was not entirely oblivious. The declassified files include references to several critical-level intelligence cables, the highest priority classification in the U.S. system, sent from NSA listening posts in Turkey and Norway to the Pentagon during June and July 1983. These cables noted unusual patterns in Soviet satellite telemetry and atypical VHF burst transmissions originating from Kazakhstan, but the analysis sections of the cables revealed that American intelligence officers interpreted these signals as related to Soviet anti-satellite weapons testing, not weather manipulation. The conceptual framework for weaponized meteorological control simply didn't exist in Western military thinking at the time. There's a tragic irony here. American atmospheric scientists in 1983 had the technical knowledge to understand ionospheric electron depletion and its effects on weather patterns. American Cygnus intelligence had the capability to detect the Soviet control, transmissions, and satellite maneuvers. But the two communities didn't communicate effectively, and the idea that the Soviets would even attempt something as exotic as beam weather suppression was so far outside the expected threat envelope that nobody connected the fragments of evidence into a coherent picture until 40 years later, when the Russian documents were finally leaked to Western intelligence by sources within the FSB, who apparently felt that certain Cold War secrets had become too dangerous to remain buried. The technical specifications revealed in the declassified schematics present genuine mysteries that even contemporary atmospheric physicists struggle to explain fully. The power requirements for Sistema Pogoda-7 seem almost impossibly high. Kosmos 1447's 12-megawatt power system, assuming the documents are accurate, would have required either a nuclear reactor, which orbital reconnaissance would have detected through thermal signatures, or a solar panel array so large that visual observation from ground-based telescopes would have spotted it immediately. The satellite's official mass was listed as 4,200 kilograms, which is substantial, but not outrageous for a Soviet spacecraft of that era. However, Calculations suggest that a magnetoplasmitic thruster capable of generating an ion beam with sufficient intensity to trigger ionospheric electron cascades at a range of 800 kilometers would require electromagnetic coils massing at least 2,000 kilograms alone, leaving minimal margin for power systems, telemetry equipment, attitude control, and the xenon propellant tankage. Some aerospace engineers who've reviewed the declassified schematics have quietly suggested that the specifications might be partially disinformation, perhaps mixing elements of Sistema Pogoda-7 with details from unrelated Soviet space programs to obscure the actual technical approach. Others have proposed that Kosmos 1447 might have carried an experimental high-energy density capacitor system based on principles that Western science hasn't replicated even today, possibly exploiting metastable helium compounds or exotic dielectric materials that Soviet research had developed in secrecy. The operation ended abruptly on August 18, 1983. The Soviet logs indicate that Kosmos 1447 executed an emergency deorbit burn, re-entering the atmosphere over the Pacific Ocean at a trajectory that ensured complete destruction. The official explanation provided to tracking stations was a critical failure in the satellite's thermal control system, but the declassified documents tell a different story. On August 16th, atmospheric sensors aboard the Tu-2 for 3 drones detected what Soviet operators called an inverse precipitation event, a sudden massive increase in electron density at the 287-kilometer altitude band directly over the Kansas target zone. The ionosphere, which Sistema Pogoda-7 had been depleting for 3 months, had apparently developed some kind of rebound effect, a self-correcting mechanism that began flooding the suppression zone with electrons at rates that exceeded the satellite's capacity to strip them away within 36 hours. The electron density had climbed 2 levels 17% above normal background conditions, and meteorological stations in Kansas began reporting the first significant rainfall in over 90 days. The precipitation that followed was abnormally intense. Between August 19th and August 23rd, parts of Kansas received 3 times their normal monthly rainfall, triggering flash flooding that caused more economic damage than the preceding drought. Soviet mission logs describe a sense of near panic among the Sistema Pogoda-7 operators. The system had lost control. The atmosphere was exhibiting behaviors that the theoretical models hadn't predicted. Kharitonov himself apparently recommended immediate termination of the operation and destruction of the orbital component to prevent what he described as cascading ionospheric instability, though the documents don't elaborate on what that term meant or what consequences he feared. Here's where the story takes a turn that elevates it from classified Cold War history into something considerably stranger. Remember that NOAA researcher Dr. Ellen Wikström, whose paper was retracted in 1983. In 2019, a retired CIA analyst named Howard Feldstein published a memoir titled Invisible Battlefields, in which he claimed that Vic hadn't stopped researching after her paper's retraction, according to Feldstein, who said he'd been assigned to monitor potential security breaches related to atmospheric research. Wikström had continued collecting ionospheric data using amateur radio equipment from her home in Boulder, Colorado, throughout the late 1980s. She'd developed a private theory that the 1983 Kansas drought had been artificially induced, and she'd been attempting to document similar ionospheric signatures over other regions. Feldstein wrote that Wikström had contacted him in 1991, claiming she'd detected the same 6-hour, 40-3-minute periodicity in ionospheric disturbances over Ukraine during a severe drought in 1990, and again over India during unusually intense monsoon rains in 1991. she'd believed that Sistema Pogoda-7 or something very much like it was still operational after the Cold War's end. Feldstein didn't take her seriously. He described her as obsessive and potentially paranoid. Ellen Wikström died in a car accident in 1994. Her personal research archives were never recovered. Feldstein's memoir dedicates only 3 pages to Wikström, and he expresses regret that he didn't investigate her claims more thoroughly. The timing is curious. The Indian monsoon intensification in 1991 occurred during a period of extreme political instability in the Soviet Union. Hardline elements within the Soviet military and KGB were actively resisting Gorbachev's reforms and plotting the August coup that would briefly overthrow him. Is it possible that Sistema Pogoda-7 or a successor system was activated during that chaotic period by rogue operators pursuing their own agenda? The declassified documents don't address this question, because they cover only the original 1983 Kansas operation. The re-emergence of this story in 2023 stems from an unexpected source. In December 2022, an elderly Russian scientist named Viktor Anatolievich Rumyantsov died in Moscow at age 8. Rumyantsov had been a junior engineer on the Sistema Pogoda-7 project, responsible primarily for maintenance of the ground-based radar systems at sea. 6 weeks after his death, a package arrived at the U.S. Embassy in Tallinn, Estonia, sent anonymously, but postmarked from Moscow. The package contained a USB drive holding scanned documents, engineering diagrams, and a handwritten letter in Russian, apparently written by Rumyantsov. In the final weeks of his life, the letter's opening paragraph, translated into English in the declassified report, reads, "I am the last living person who knows the activation codes for Pogoda-7 secondary systems. Kharitonov is dead. Baranov is dead. Efremov is dead." The others were silenced. I maintained silence to protect my family, but I am old and dying, and I cannot permit this knowledge to die with me. What we built was never dismantled. The orbital components burned up in 1983, but the control architecture remains. Someone with sufficient resources and technical knowledge could reconstruct the satellite component. The ionosphere remembers nothing, but the machine's blueprints remember everything. This must be revealed so that the world understands what is possible. Because if it remains secret, someone will build it again, and next time they may not stop when the atmosphere fights back. The CIA's declassification decision in October 2023 was apparently not unanimous. Portions of the Declassification Review Board's internal debate were themselves leaked to the press, revealing that several senior intelligence officials argued strenuously that the Sistema Pogoda documents should remain classified indefinitely, precisely because they provide a functional roadmap for weaponizing weather. Others argued that the technological principles were likely already known to sophisticated state actors like China, and that classification served no protective purpose while preventing legitimate scientific research into atmospheric manipulation defense systems. The declassification that ultimately occurred was partial. Entire sections of the technical schematics were redacted, particularly the specifications for the magnetoplasmic thruster and the precise frequencies and modulation patterns used by the Semipalatinsk radar array. What remains is enough to confirm that Sistema Pogoda-7 existed and functioned, but not quite enough to allow independent replication of the technology. Atmospheric physicists who reviewed the declassified materials have raised fascinating technical objections. Dr. Sara Nakamura, a professor of space physics at UC, published an analysis in the Journal of Atmospheric and Solar Terrestrial Physics in early 2024, arguing that the electron depletion mechanism described in the Soviet documents shouldn't work according to current understanding of ionospheric chemistry. The natural recombination rates of ionized nitrogen and oxygen should have replenished the depleted electrons far faster than the document suggests, making sustained weather suppression impossible without power levels orders of magnitude higher than Kosmos 1447 could have generated. Nakamura's paper stops short of calling the declassified documents fraudulent, but she suggests that either Soviet scientists had discovered ionospheric processes that remain unknown to contemporary researchers, or that the documents are misleading about the actual operational mechanism. Dr. James Rutledge, a former NOAA atmospheric scientist now at MIT, offers a different interpretation. He proposes that Sistema Pogoda-7 might have exploited a resonance effect, where relatively modest energy inputs at precisely tuned frequencies could trigger disproportionately large ionospheric responses. Similar to how a singer's voice can shatter a wine glass if the frequency matches the glass's natural resonant frequency. If the ionosphere possesses analogous resonant modes, which current atmospheric models don't account for, then the Soviet system's energy requirements become more plausible. Both researchers agree on one point. If Sistema Pogoda-7 actually worked as described, then fundamental aspects of atmospheric physics remain poorly understood even now. The geopolitical implications have been predictably contentious. Russia's foreign ministry issued a statement in November 2023 dismissing the declassified documents as Cold War fantasy materials fabricated by Western intelligence services to justify increased NATO military spending. This denial might be more credible if it weren't for the fact that the documents originated from FSB archives and were leaked by Russian sources. China's response was more measured, with a foreign ministry spokesperson saying only that all nations should refrain from militarization of atmospheric science and should pursue weather modification research exclusively for peaceful agricultural purposes, a statement that neither confirmed nor denied Chinese knowledge of Sistema Pogoda-7, but certainly suggested awareness that weather manipulation technology is feasible. American congressional hearings were held in early 2024, during which NOAA and Department of Defense officials testified that the U.S. has no active weather weapon programs, and that atmospheric modification research conducted by American agencies focuses solely on cloud, seeding, and hurricane intensity reduction. Several representatives asked pointed questions about whether the U.S. should develop defensive systems to detect and counteract foreign weather manipulation, to which military officials provided only vague assurances that all emerging threat vectors are monitored appropriately. The farmers in Kansas who lived through the 1983 drought have mixed reactions to the declassified revelations. Thomas Kowalski, who was 34 in 1983, and lost his family's wheat farm to foreclosure after the drought, told a local news station in 2024 that the Soviet explanation actually made more sense to him than the meteorological explanations he'd been given at the time. He remembered that the drought had a strange quality to it. The sky wasn't just cloudless. It felt empty in a way that's hard to articulate. He'd been farming since he was 16, had experienced droughts before, and the 1983 drought felt different at some fundamental level. Other farmers interviewed expressed skepticism, suggesting that the declassified documents might be elaborate disinformation, but several mentioned details that align eerily with the Sistema Pogoda-7 operational profile. Unusual radio interference affecting AM broadcasts during specific hours. Strange contrails that didn't match normal flight patterns, and a sense that the weather had a geometric quality, as if the drought boundary was too perfect, too circular to be entirely natural. Then there's the question of whether Sistema Pogoda-7 represents a unique historical anomaly or the first publicly known example of a technology that multiple nations have since developed independently. In 2002, the U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld responded to a question about weather modification by saying that the Pentagon does not engage in weather warfare, but that weather modification is likely to become more common in the future as technology advances, a statement that seemed to acknowledge the possibility without confirming any American programs. China has been remarkably open about its cloud seeding operations, which it used extensively during the 2008 Beijing Olympics to ensure clear skies. For the opening ceremony, the Chinese program is officially described as rain-making technology using silver iodide dispersal, but the scale of the infrastructure involved, including thousands of rocket launchers and aircraft, suggests capabilities that go beyond simple cloud seeding. In 2020, China announced plans to expand its weather modification capabilities to cover 5.5 million square kilometers, an area larger than India. The stated purpose is agricultural optimization, but the dual-use potential is obvious. The most unsettling aspect of the Sistema Pogoda-7 revelation might be the questions it raises about attribution. If a nation experiences unusual weather patterns, a severe drought or unexpected flooding, how would anyone determine whether the event was natural or artificially induced? The ionospheric signatures that Dr. Wikström detected required specialized equipment and expertise to measure, and even then, her findings were dismissed as anomalous. The geopolitical implications of attribution uncertainty are profound. If country A believes that country B has weaponized weather and suspects that recent agricultural losses were caused by foreign weather manipulation, but cannot prove it definitively, what response is justified? Would weather warfare constitute an act of war under international law? The UN Convention on the Prohibition of Military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques, signed in 1977, prohibits weather warfare, but the treaty is vague about definitions and enforcement mechanisms. The 1983 Kansas drought, if it was indeed caused by Sistema Pogoda, occurred after this treaty was in effect, suggesting that international legal prohibitions may be less constraining than governments would like to admit. There are deeper patterns embedded in the Sistema story that speak to the nature of classified research and the information asymmetries that define geopolitical competition. For 40 years, this technology existed in a realm of complete secrecy. Thousands of people, perhaps tens of thousands including farmers, meteorologists, intelligence analysts, and scientists, encountered fragments of evidence that something unusual was happening, but none of them possessed enough information to understand the complete picture. The compartmentalization was so effective that even within the Soviet military, only a handful of individuals understood the full scope of Sistema Pogoda-7's capabilities. Kharitonov knew the physics. Satellite operators knew the orbital mechanics. Radar technicians knew the ionospheric monitoring protocols. But apparently, very few knew how all the pieces fit together. This is how transformative technologies remain hidden. Not through universal silence, but through fragmentation of knowledge. After Rumyantsev's death, after the last person who understood the complete system was gone, only then did the full truth emerge. It makes you wonder what other technologies exist right now in classified programs, understood by aging specialists who will eventually die, taking their knowledge with them unless they choose, as Rumyantsev did, to breach the secrecy in their final days. The atmospheric science community has responded to the Sistema Pogoda-7 revelations with a mixture of fascination and frustration. Researchers who study ionospheric physics now face a challenge. They have partial specifications for a system that apparently worked, but that violates some aspects of current atmospheric theory. Do they trust the Soviet documents and revise their theoretical models, or do they maintain their existing frameworks and dismiss the documents as incomplete or inaccurate? Several research groups have proposed experiments to test whether electron depletion cascades can be artificially triggered in the ionosphere, using ground-based high-frequency radio transmitters, similar in principle to the HAARP facility in Alaska, though scaled down to avoid any possibility of weather modification. These proposals have encountered significant resistance from funding agencies, partly due to concerns about dual-use implications and partly due to skepticism about the underlying physics. Science progresses through replication, but when the phenomenon you're trying to replicate was a classified military program that operated for a few months in 1983, replication becomes extraordinarily difficult. If you've made it this far into this investigation, you're probably thinking about the same question that's been on my mind since I first read the declassified documents. What happened to the ground-based systems? Rumyantsev's letter claimed that the control architecture remains, implying that the Sistema Pogoda-7 facility wasn't dismantled after 1983. The declassified files don't address the disposition of the ground systems. Satellite imagery of the Sistema Pogoda-7 region from the 1990s and 2000s shows various abandoned Soviet military installations, but without knowing the precise location of the Sistema Pogoda-7 radar array, it's impossible to determine from open-source imagery whether the facility still exists in any functional form. Kazakhstan gained independence in 1991, and the Russian military withdrew from most facilities in the country over the subsequent decade. If the Sistema Pogoda-7 ground systems were abandoned in place, they might still exist as decaying ruins in the steppe. If they were deemed strategically valuable, they might have been dismantled and relocated to Russian territory. Or, and this is the possibility that keeps me up at night, they might still be maintained in operational status, waiting for a reconstructed orbital component that would bring the complete system back online. The story of Sistema Pogoda-7 is the story of atmosphere as battleground, of invisible warfare conducted in the charged particle layer 60 miles above our heads, of a technology so exotic that its very existence was unbelievable until the evidence became undeniable. It's the story of scientists who built something they couldn't fully control and operators who ran a machine until the atmosphere itself fought back. It's the story of secrets that lasted 40 years and the last man who knew the truth, choosing to reveal it rather than let it die with him. Most of all, it's a story without a clear ending, because the fundamental questions remain unanswered. Did Sistema Pogoda-7 really cause the 1983 Kansas drought? Or is the declassified evidence less conclusive than it appears? Were there other operations, other targets, other droughts and floods that we've attributed to nature when they were actually engineered? What capabilities exist today, hidden in classified programs in Russia, China, the United States, and perhaps other nations? Capabilities that make Sistema Pogoda-7 look primitive by comparison. We're living in an era where the distinction between natural and artificial weather events may already be blurred beyond recognition, where attribution has become impossible without access to classified monitoring systems that detect ionospheric anomalies. The skies above us may be contested territory in ways that civilian populations don't recognize and can't defend against. And if that possibility doesn't concern you, then you haven't really grasped the implications of what was revealed in those declassified files. If this deep dive into classified weather warfare technology fascinated you, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and most importantly, drop a comment below with your theory. Do you think Sistema Pogoda-7 was a one-time Cold War experiment? Or do you believe weather manipulation technology is being actively used today? Have you noticed unusual weather patterns in your region that might indicate artificial modification? What other Cold War technologies do you think remain classified, waiting for someone like Rumyantsev to reveal them in a final act of conscience? Your engagement keeps this channel running and helps these hidden histories reach more people who deserve to know the truth. Until the next investigation, keep looking up, keep questioning, and remember that the most powerful weapons are often the ones you can't see.